Okay, so another video. This is about a really important practice, which we call practicing the presence of God. And it's a bridge practice between your deep meditation and your regular working life. And I can't really give you advice on how often to do this because I don't want to overshoot it or undershoot it based on your level of spiritual advancement. So what I want to say is that this just has to become a part of what you do. You make time for God's presence in your life. You make time to notice it, and you make time to be with it in a conscious way. And I say conscious because we know that in deep meditation, we're almost, in a sense, losing consciousness. Certainly at the deeper, if we're considering stage 1 to stage 5 meditation, stage 5 is a complete lack of consciousness on the part of the person praying. They won't know they're in a state of prayer. They won't know that they exist. They won't be able to notice they're in a state of meditation in any way if they're in stage 5 meditation. So stage 4, it could be quite deep and profound. You may have no thoughts going on, but you're still aware you're meditating. And you could probably think a thought if you decided to. You may have enough access to your conscious will to make a decision to think. But stage 5 is even deeper than that, and there's no consciousness whatsoever. You only know you're there by coming out and realizing that maybe an amount of time has lapsed that you were unaware of. So this kind of meditation requires a sort of supplemental kind of meditation that is a bridge. But it's a bridge to a conscious experience with God. And it requires some practice of subtlety. I think it's about becoming subtle and becoming soft and becoming present in a very subtle and relaxed way and entering the sense of the sacred. So how to teach this is not easy. This is something I almost prefer to do in a class with people where I can maybe try to help initiate that state in people better. But I thought we must make a video on this because it's so important. And so what I was thinking is, if you're going to practice this kind of prayer, the thing to do would be to set aside 20 minutes or half an hour to be with God and have no agenda and to treat it truly as sacred. To really, so you wouldn't want to do this until you were really willing to do it, right? You might even wait till an opportune time. If you're really new, you might not want to try to force this. But nevertheless, the notion is that you would want to go spend time with God, listening and participating in God's presence and doing nothing else. But in this type of practice, it is with the intent not to lose consciousness of the world. So one ideal, for many people, I would think an ideal place to practice this would be in nature, at a park, in your backyard, under your favorite tree, at your home. But really any place will do. That sense of the sacred can be found anywhere where you can remain undisturbed, at least in the beginning. This is a great practice if you have chaos in your home. Also, I have to say, if you are unable to control your environment all the time, if you have roommates, life partners, husbands, wives, children, then you can't control your environment all the time. And this is also a nice practice to where you can participate in God's power and allow the world to be a part of that experience. So, right, because we pray and meditate, we close our eyes, we go into our inner room, we shut our inner door, and we pray in secret. This is how Jesus taught us to pray. And what is absorbed in those places is power from God and transformation. Power with intent, God's intent. And it transforms our souls and our minds and our hearts. And so there's these changes happening as a result of our meditation practice, but we want to participate in those changes and notice them. We want to enjoy the fruits of God's existence, and we want to be able to dwell with God. And how do we open the door for that? And that's kind of what this is about. And so I don't care really if you sit in nature or if you sit in your living room. To me, it makes no difference where I do it. It only matters that I do it. But it may be for you, opportune to begin in nature if that's an easier experience for you. But don't think you've got to drive to the mountains to do this, or you'll really never do it in any consistent way. So having said that, what you would do is you would sit down and you would be basically comfortable. You don't have to be as reclined as most people are when they do our kind of prayer. You could be sitting in a lawn chair outside, or on your couch at home, and you just sit and get comfortable, and then you enter into the sacred with God. And obviously one of the aspects of that is to let go of the world and to cease thinking about, your desires and activities and your responsibilities and, all the things that draw our attention into the world. You would let that go. And then what I would say is you would invite God's presence to be with you. And actually, let's back up one step. I'll give you like a bit of a technique to try. This isn't dogma. It doesn't have to be done in these steps. But this might be a good way just to introduce the practice, even though it's not the only way to do it. But one thing to do would be just to notice your body and your mind and your heart. Notice it. And when I say notice it, I don't mean think about it. I mean feel it. So you might just take some time to notice that you can feel your body and that it's always feeling like something, but that we're oftentimes busy enough that we don't notice that we're feeling our body, that it actually is sending sensory information. We can notice that we have a body. It's there. And you can feel that it's there. And that's a great way to begin this listening practice. Listening for God's presence would be just to start by noticing that you have hands. And noticing that you have feet. Noticing that you have a face. Just feeling the existence of your belly, your hips. And then a great practice to introduce then would be just to begin to relax. It's very important that we relax because we're trying to come into God's power, and our tension is like fear and resistance and force and trying, and there's all this will energy wrapped up in our tension. It's causing that tension. So to just begin to let go of tension and maybe moods, subtle moods and expressions in your face, and just letting go of all of that, and just dwelling in your body in a relaxed way with no agenda in the will, grinding away at something. And once you can feel that you've maybe let go of something, you can feel that bit of a subtle change. And once you can listen to just how it feels in your body, just to have a body, and also your emotional self. Just what does it feel like in there? Just notice it. Doesn't matter what it is, but you just notice what's going on with you, which is, even an essential piece of self-examination, noticing the subtle emotions and energies that are going on with us, right? I'm in resistance. It's subtle, but it's there. I've got an agenda. It's subtle, but it's there. And there's all that force. There's all that sin just in there trying to control the world and others and ourselves. You can just notice that's all there and just see it. That's how it feels to be in your body. And you can notice your mind, if it's grinding away or if it's floating gently. Is it still and quiet? You can just notice, just what is it like? And this is all what happens naturally if you spend time in prayer. But then it can be pointed out and little shortcuts for you. So that process would be just, it depends. It could be a couple of minutes, it could be 5 minutes of just noticing everything, taking the time to notice everything. And then you would invite God's presence to dwell in your mind and your heart and in your body. And you would give it permission to come and dwell inside of you and do its will inside of you. And you might even state, as I often do, that I just want to know you fully. I want to know you completely, God. I want to come to be faithful to you and come to dwell with you in a deep way. And then what you do after you make that invitation is you listen for the subtle changes that happen in your emotional being, in your mind, and in your body. You're still listening to your feet and your legs and your hands, your arms and your belly and your chest. You're still listening to all of that. And you're listening for the change that comes when you invite God to dwell inside of you in this way. And it can be extremely subtle, and that's okay. But the notion is that you would just begin to learn how to listen for it in this way. I say listen, but clearly I don't just mean with your ears. Listening with your senses for God's presence. And listening with your heart and mind for God's presence. Opening yourself up to be with God. And this isn't done with the eyes closed. This practice is done with the environment as a part of that experience. So if it's your living room, or if it's your bedroom, or if it's your backyard, or wherever it is, you're now just listening for God's power in that place. And okay, so that's the general practice. That's the general idea of what you would do. And what I want to say about that now is, how is it going to feel to you? And I had a client yesterday that is now maybe coming to a place where she can listen to God's presence a little bit in an authentic way. We're hoping that. And she used some language that I think is very useful. She said, I think I was looking for the wrong feeling. I was looking for, I think in this case she said humility, but she thought it would make her feel happier or more peaceful or something like that, and it doesn't. What she noticed is that when she really tried to hear God and find humility, she felt an emptiness. And Christian language is not so suited to that word, an emptiness, right? A nothingness. But the mystics use it all the time. The Christian mystics use it all the time. And so you can see how if you have an agenda of how God's presence might reveal itself, you could miss you're looking for peace or joy or a sense of love. And that's fine if it came, but honestly, it's not going to come like that very much. It's going to come in many other ways you don't understand yet. And so we have to come into this so innocent and just say, okay, I'm making time for God's presence to be in me, whatever it is. And I know in another video I've sort of explained a little of this, but it's so important. It's very important that we don't have an agenda of how our experience of it will be. And in a way, it doesn't matter if we even experience God's presence. It doesn't even matter if we feel it. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we learn to listen for it. That we genuinely learn to use our body like an antenna to listen for God's presence in a deep way. And so the will and the mind and the senses are all involved trying to hear God's presence. And God's presence runs a massive range from the overtly powerful, so powerful that, it can feel dangerous, to so subtle that you simply cannot feel it. And every just pretend that's a scale, and every stage in between those two extremes brings gifts and delights to the soul that none of the other octaves do. So that you would never, ever want to miss any one of those. And, I think when God arrives in a soul so subtly you can barely tell it's there, my experience with that energy in what I see it do in people is that it teaches that soul to become subtle. Because there's a subtlety that has to be found to find that energy, right? It's there, but it's so subtle you almost can't tell it's there. And if you had any agenda of how it had to look or feel, you'd be missing it. If you were looking, trying to find some joy, you would not even notice this barely perceptible power from God shining in you. So we have to let God be the teacher, and we have to take God at God's word that if we invite God to dwell with us, God does. And I know this to be a fact, but I know that you might not know that yet. So then you're I don't feel anything, so God must have not answered. But it's not like that at all. God certainly is there with you. And so think of the spectrum from you can't feel it at all, even if you get very subtle to hear it, all the way from it's so loud and powerful you can't accept it, even if you muster up all the courage you have. Think of that spectrum being maybe the total range of human experience with noticing God's presence. So it could come so subtly you can't feel it. But the gift and the quality of soul and the capacity of a soul who learns to listen in that emptiness is great. It is great. It changes a soul to learn to become that subtle and have that capacity to listen for God's presence. That changes a soul. And I know because God began with me really loud. So for 10 years, it was there were very subtle dimensions in there, but it was all that extremely noticeable, bright kind of power. And when it began to show up in these other ways, I couldn't hear it. I know when the shift happened because the up went away. And I know that it took me over a year, unfortunately, but I didn't have good theology. I didn't know better. But it took me over a year to notice that God's presence actually was there, but in a way that had nothing to do with the previous 10 years of experience that I had with God's power that I had come to associate as God's presence. It wasn't love, and it wasn't peace, and it wasn't joy, and it wasn't psychedelic, and it wasn't very mystical, it wasn't visionary. It was none of the up energies. It was actually this other completely different dimension. But it took me about a year before I noticed it was there, and I really thought I had lost God. And that's a lot like many people start in that stage. I did that stage later. Most people kind of start in that stage, I've noticed. And so they're inviting God in and they're not feeling it. And I know for sure, if you're inviting God in your life, that God is in your life. I know that for sure. So you need to take the time to listen for it. And maybe not make it so formal that, I made this very formal approach. Go sit outside and invite it in. Do that. But you might also just, in certain moments, just listen again for God's power. Just notice it. Even as I said that, my hands and feet felt 2 degrees warmer, just as I listened for God's power. I don't know that they got warmer, but I noticed the warmth in my hands and feet as I told you to listen, because I listened as I said it. So I just noticed my own body and my own sense of center. And over time, you begin to discern God's presence there. Technically speaking, we don't say it's God's presence. Technically speaking, we say it is the effect that God's presence is having on you. So that's a technicality. It's an important one. So I'm going to go ahead and say it the way I've been saying it. But technically speaking, we don't really say it's God's presence so much as we say it's the effect God's presence had on us. This helps us to let God be God and not turn God into our sensory experience. It helps us to have an infinite God and not a God of our understanding that we sort of make into an idol, even though it's through our mystical experience with God. So this is a Christian principle that preserves the infinite nature of God and the finite nature of the creature, that's you and me, and its capacity to know God. So technically speaking, we wouldn't really directly say you're feeling God's presence. Really would just say you're feeling the effects God's presence is having in you. So always keep that in mind whenever I talk about feeling God's presence. It's an important piece. But in this case, it wouldn't even matter if you felt it. It wouldn't matter if you felt God's presence or not. But you might. It might be so subtle that you're not sure it's there. But if you could get out of mind about that, if you could just let yourself be there with God's presence in that extremely subtle way, then you are being now trained by the Holy Spirit. This is how we discover that we are trained by the Holy Spirit. This is how it happens. So God's power will reveal itself to us in these very often extremely subtle ways. So very subtle, you can hardly notice it. But what I've noticed is that the person who becomes a student of this, part of the practice, is trained by God's power in this way. And whereas here's the range that is possible of human experience, this is where they were. Very narrow experience, and then God begins to train them to have much more access and much more refined and varied states of being and states of consciousness. And so that's stage one of the practice, is setting aside some time to be still and just try to notice that power. And knowing also that it may appear completely non-sensory, that we may be unable to feel it at all, and that is still a part of the experience with God. They say the God of Christianity is the God of the desert, right? The God of the desert. And the desert is an interesting place because you go out in the desert. We have lots of desert around Utah, the West Desert, right? Everywhere West Desert. And you go and you think it's just gray and there's nothing there. But if you go out in it, just go walk in it. And if you move slow, and if you look around, everywhere you look is this subtle beauty going on. And there's life everywhere too. You wouldn't think there's all this life, but there's all this life out there. And you just don't see it if you're moving fast. You have to slow down and you have to get still. And then all of a sudden there's these things you notice that you couldn't notice if you didn't slow down and get still. That's what this practice is about. God is dwelling with you. If you have invited God to dwell in your life, if that's a regular part of your life, then God is living with you. And it would be a sad thing to miss that and not make that into a practice and hopefully even into more of a working part of your life rather than just a practice. It would be such a sad thing not to notice God's power dwelling in your life and not to make a place for that. Another way of looking at this, coming from the part where you may feel nothing, is just, we could call it also remembering God, right? We could also call it that. Remembering that God is with us. Whether you feel it or not isn't that relevant. I have learned not to care whether I can feel God's power or not. I don't care. I don't gauge my spirituality based on whether I feel it or I don't feel it. That has turned out to be an illusory path that led to, well, really a kind of sensuality, spiritual sensuality that I think keeps someone a beginner forever. So it doesn't matter if you feel it. Then you might even just think of it as you're remembering God's presence. Just remembering that God is dwelling in every cell in your body. Remembering that God is dwelling in your nervous system, your organs, in your brain, in your face, in your skin. That God is all the way present with you and that you are inside of God. So it's just a way of opening that door. And maybe it should be this will be my first short video, looks like. Maybe it should be a second video to discuss the next step of that. This is a preliminary step to something I think is maybe even more important, which is, how do you combine activity with God's presence? And because if you fly a kite with God's presence, you fly it differently than without. If you caress your wife or husband, you caress them differently in God's power than outside of it. And if you play music differently in God's power than outside of it. If you walk down the road for an evening stroll, you walk differently inside of God's power than outside of it. If you parent differently inside rather than outside of it. This turns out to be a very important key to spiritual living, which is that all of our activities are supposed to spring from our awareness of God, our interests and our pursuits, all in a life that is not sinful. All of it first comes from God's power dwelling in us in a certain way and us responding to that power. And that is another tricky level of practice, which is really living, because what we find is that God's power is presented to us in a certain way. Let's say that it is very gentle and quite subtle. So let's say that's the way that it's, and that's how I feel it now, so I think that's why I choose that. So let's say that it is very gentle and very subtle. That's the effect God is having on my soul. So when I now go to engage in an activity of some kind, my job is to make sure that my mind and its intensity, and my will and its intensity, and my physical actions and its intensity matches that power. It's in harmony with that power. And that's just figured out by trial and error. It's just trial and error how you figure that out. You could tell when you're overshooting it, and you can tell when you're undershooting it. And so you just over time, you're just trying to bring the whole complex system that is the human being into harmony with what God is doing in your soul. Now, someone might just be thinking, that's way too advanced. I understand that, and that's okay. Don't think, oh, I'm not a good Christian if I don't worry about any of it. It's really okay. But at the same time, realize you're invited to this. If it's God's will for me to go to the store, just going to the store doesn't accomplish God's will. It's the state of being I go to the store in that accomplishes God's will. It's the gentleness and it's that place. And if don't turn this into a stick to beat yourself with, of course, but just begin to introduce this into your life in areas maybe where it's comfortable for you, because it is absolutely essential. It is absolutely essential. And also it's delightful. That's the other thing you might want to know. It's not to be missed. It's something quite beautiful and wonderful. And really, you have your whole life to get to a place where you're always in that state. Don't berate yourself and think, I got to do it today. I have one student who I know did that. We've discovered that it was forced rather than entered into, and it turned into sort of a sort of dogma, where they were always forcing themselves into what they thought was that place, but it was really a very willful, dogmatic act, and it did not lead to deep spirituality. So don't try super hard. Don't try to make it happen, but just begin to open up to those opportunities, especially when there's a chance of service. I know when I'm with my daughter, I try to do that, and if I'm with my wife, that's a good time. And the dog comes up wanting some love. What a time to enter into that place and be a channel for God's power, right? Like to refocus and recenter into that place. And then if I'm just lost in some activity, that's okay too. I don't worry about that at all. I have Christ and I have salvation, and salvation is leading me into union. I'm going to get there. But so this is just a supplemental practice to begin noticing God's power and then finding out what it means to move in God's power. In whatever kind of movement you happen to be engaged in and willing to try it. And enlightenment would be always moving in God's power all the time, and also at a very high level. And so it's a part of the journey to, begin to enjoy listening and being with God. And I have to just say that faith is a part of this, because faith is the evidence of things unseen. And faith is always, well, it doesn't now, but it has always annoyed me, this notion of faith. It was always a stumbling block, and now I would say it's foundational to my spirituality. I don't need to feel God's presence to know God is with me. So right in this moment, whether I feel God's presence or not, I can abide with God. I can just abide with God. And it reminds me of this monk that I work with, and he said he doesn't particularly feel God's presence. I'm not sure how true that is. He's not lying, but I can tell it's around him, and I think he feels it in ways. But he said, I'm just aware that God is present. I'm aware. He uses this word, I'm aware of God's presence. He doesn't always use the word, I feel it. And awareness is faith. Faith is a mental awareness. It's a mental openness. It's one of the gifts of the Spirit that applies to the intellect rather than to the will. So faith is this ability, this capacity to know that God is present with you and to abide in that knowing, and not to require evidence for that, just to abide in it. And it has its own delight. I don't feel anything lacking when I'm abiding in the knowing that God is with me and I don't feel it. I don't feel there is something lacking when I don't feel it as compared to when I do. And this is really important, foundational Christian mysticism. And if anyone is coming from more of a New Age place, or possibly there are other backgrounds that might lend one to have a little bit of a rift with what I'm saying, let me just tell you that this is not a religion's attempt to control people. Here's what my mind said when I first began to be taught about faith. To me, my mind said, well, sure, you don't really have God's presence, so you just sit around believing you do. That sounds like what a controlling religion might hoist upon people. Just trust us, it's there, but you don't feel it, but just trust us. And I suppose a false religion or teacher could use that, certainly, to control people or trick them. But in this case, it's you exploring this capacity that faith gives you to be radically open to God without sensory input. It doesn't mean you'll never have sensory input. It doesn't mean that at all. That's not the point at all. But awareness, mental awareness, like if right now, if you just said, God is dwelling with me, and then you rested in the wake of that statement. God is dwelling with me right now. And you rest in the wake of that statement. There is a certain quality to the wake. There is a certain quality to the silence that follows that statement that is different than the quality of whatever this is before the statement. That's faith. And we can come to know a lot about God's existence through faith. a lot. And we can come to kinds of stability through faith that we can't come to in other ways. Okay, so that's the whole video. Thank you all for listening. And as usual, remember, if there are any questions at all about any of these, you are welcome to write them in the comment section below the video, and I will answer them. One person wrote in a question. I thought it was really good. I just made a whole video about the answer. So go ahead and do that. If there's any questions or follow-up, maybe you practice it and you have questions, please feel free. I really want to help people come to a relationship with God that is deep and meaningful. And this is a part of that. And it's delightful. This faith thing, this ability to notice God when you don't feel it, is a very powerful and delightful part of spirituality. Okay, thank you all very much for listening.